You're going to bring that to me before we're about to end the plenary, and then we'll look through those questions and hope to answer as many as we can during the time that we have. Okay? And your second card, now this is probably the most important card, the most important note card you've ever experienced in your life. And what we want you to do with the second card is to answer this question. So what in this current historical moment gives you hope? And it could be a person, it could be a group, a movement, something much bigger than that. Whatever it is, what gives you hope and why? And that will come in again towards the end of the plenary. So I hope that you will, humor me in doing this, and hopefully you'll be very excited that you decided to do this. So we are not going to encourage you to do that right in this moment, so whenever you have a chance, please do, and we'll come back to it. So I'd like to get us started by introducing our panelists. Now Leslie told me I'm not allowed to even say much at all about them. And yes, and before we get started with the introduction for our panelists, we actually have a very, very special guest for tonight. So most of you know that August 6th and then August 9th is the 68th anniversary of the U.S. bombings on the cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And with us tonight we have Satsuko Thurlow, who is a Habashka from Hiroshima. She was 13 years old when the bomb dropped. She currently lives in Toronto, and she was given a very high honor, most recently by the Canadian government for her peace work. So we'd like to invite Satsuko Thurlow up to the podium for a quick greeting. Thank you so much.
I feel privileged to be here and to meet you, the members of War Resistance League. As someone who grew up in ultra-nationalistic and militaristic countries, and as a result, experienced the brutality of war as a child, I offer to you my utmost admiration and appreciation for your conviction about the sanctity of each and every human life, and your fearless rejection of institutionalized violence and oppression, and your courageous efforts to create a world where people can live with dignity, justice, and peace. At the age of 13, I experienced the indiscriminate mass murder of atomic bombing of Hiroshima. Just one airplane and just one bomb incinerated, flattened and incinerated my beloved city of Hiroshima. With 360,000 people, most of them were children and women and elderly. And 3 days later, people of Nagasaki experienced similar atrocity. In both cities, over 200,000 people perished. And I personally lost 8 of my immediate family and close relatives, and 351 schoolmates. But the worst story of Hiroshima is that 68 years later, radiation exposed survivors are still dying today.
That's right.
However, out of ashes, out of living hell, many survivors have transcended our personal tragedies over the years. And instead of hatred and revenge, have chosen to dedicate ourselves to make warning to the world about the dangers of nuclear age, and have advocated our need to have a cultural transformation away from our obsession with violence and war.
Right on.
And for that end, nuclear disarmament and elimination of nuclear weapons. The progress for nuclear disarmament has been too slow, too limited. Yet, President Obama acknowledged in Prague in 2009 U.S. moral responsibility to work towards nuclear disarmament, since USA is the only country which has actually used such a weapon of mass destruction. Imagine, he was the only US president who has such profound thoughts and had courage to articulate publicly. The world commended him for that then, and the world has been disappointed since then
That's right. That's right.
by his limited accomplishments in this regard. The Republican Party must cease to interfere with the president and allow him and support him to attend to the urgent tasks such as, I can't think of the right word, the comprehensive nuclear test ban treaty and nuclear weapon conventions, fissile material cutoff treaty, and so on, during his second term. It is essential that we seize this opportunity while he is in White House. In a few days, we'll be observing the 68th anniversary of Hiroshima and Nagasaki atomic bombing. Have the prayers of hibakusha survivors such as myself for the total elimination of nuclear weapons in their lifetime being achieved. As the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, which came into force 43 years ago, been productive, effective.
No.
While the global community has succeeded in outlawing chemical and biological weapons, landmines, and and the cluster munitions. Why has the global community failed to outlaw the worst weapon, the nuclear weapon? The immoral, illegal, and inhumane weapon. We must not wait any longer. We must demand our governments to act. And that pressure must come from us, the people at the grassroots. Let us renew our commitment and intensify our commitment to the totally totally nuclear weapon-free world and world without war. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Setsuko Yulo, for being here with us tonight. That was a great honor, and we really appreciate you being with us. All right, so let's get started with our panelists for this evening. And again, I'm not really allowed to give any introduction at all. I apologize, but we're encouraging folks to read everyone's bios in your conference packet. So tonight we have Phyllis Bennis, Bruce Gagnon, Arvind Gupta, and Ines King. So I'm going to join y'all. Yeah. Does that sound good? All right. Is this mic on? No. Turn it on. Is it on now? Yes. Okay. All right. Well, thanks again for being here, everyone. So our first question tonight, speaking to global politics, economics, and the environment, which of course would include a discussion of militarism and capitalism, what are some examples of how things have changed in recent years, and what is the current landscape in this moment? Phyllis, shall we start with you?
Well,
It's on.
was it really on earlier? To the person that watches the bands. Well, thanks first to the War Resisters League for the invitation to be with you tonight. It's a great opportunity. I've been hearing great things about the discussion so far, and I'm looking forward to more. I also want to say that I think it's a really great thing that the War Resisters League is meeting here in the Hariri building. Maybe in the presence of hundreds of committed pacifist revolutionaries might do something to transform the spirit of what might have come before. So let's just leave it at that. We're looking right now, if we're looking at what has changed, I'm going to deal with the war side rather than the environment or political side. But if we look at the question of empire, the US remains an empire, but it is very definitely an empire in decline. Now the problem is empires in decline are still empires, and they are some of the most dangerous. That's somehow, it's like when somebody gets cornered, they become much more dangerous. That's true of empires as much as it is of people, of countries, of all those things. The particular problem we see with the decline of the US empire is that it's only declining in certain arenas. So its ability, because of the economic crisis, to engage as with major economic pressure has diminished a lot. Its ability to engage with political, cultural, diplomatic pressure has significantly diminished, largely because it's lost credibility all around the world. So what's left is military. When you look at all the various kinds of power, they like to talk about hard power, meaning the military, soft power, everything else. The US has kind of not done too good on the soft power side of things, but it does really well with the military. And the problem is you then get into the hammer and nail conundrum. If you're a hammer, everything looks like a nail. If you're a declining superpower where the only real instrument you have left is your military, everything looks like it needs military intervention. Talk to one Samantha Power, for instance. She kind of wrote the book that if there's a human rights violation, you need military intervention to solve it. So that's kind of the moment that we're in at this kind of end of days, if you will, of the end of US empire, which can last a really, really long time. It can last generations, so we shouldn't have any illusions about it's about to end or something like that. We also should not have the illusion that it'll end on its own, that we can sit back and take a vacation. I mean, I think we'd all like to, but that ain't in the cards anytime soon. So no vacations. But the question of what we do about it, well, I'm not gonna get into that here, we'll get into some of that later, becomes really key when we look at what's happening in the world. So I'm gonna just talk briefly about some of the things that are going on in my favorite part of the world, the Middle East, West Asia, North Africa, that whole broad sector of the world where the US is facing some of its gravest crises right now. One of the things that hasn't changed very much is US strategy and interests in the Middle East. So there's three, and they've been the same pretty much since the beginning of the Cold War. Oil, Israel, and stability and bases and the ability to attack other countries from somewhere, all of which you could put in the category of control of territory. So those three things are still the major US interests in the region. But they're playing out in a pretty different way than they used to play out. Essentially, the US is losing in all three of those ways. So if you look first at the question of oil, well, we lost the war in Iraq. The war in Iraq wasn't only about oil, but oil was obviously a big part of it. So the goal was to get control, not so much about access, because access is not a problem. You know, the oil industry is a joint industry, and if there's oil out there in the market, anybody who wants it and can pay for it can get it. So it's not about access, it's about control. Controlling the pipelines, controlling who gets pipelines, controlling who gets access to more resources. That's what the US wanted. It loses the war in Iraq, and it loses control of Iraqi oil. Certainly US oil interests are in there, but they're competing with the oil interests of the Netherlands, of Britain, of France, of China, of Russia, of China, of China, of China. It's competing with a lot of others, right? So they're not in control. Then the US lost 500 bases in one fell swoop when it lost the war in Iraq. That was pretty big. That was pretty major. Now, granted, some of them were little tiny baby bases, but some of them were huge, and they really could have been used to take off to attack parts of Africa, to attack almost anywhere. You know, part of the reason the Middle East is so important is because it's the meeting of the three continents. That hasn't changed. Location, location, location applies to empires as much as it does to real estate. So this becomes a continuing important issue. We should note that the US, since 2010, has imported more oil from Africa than from all of the Middle East. That's an indication of how we're losing the oil stuff in the Middle East. Quickly, on the question of Israel, US support for Israel has only grown. President Obama, despite the extraordinary speech he gave in Cairo, has been, in the words of Israeli leaders, the most pro-Israeli president there has ever been, despite the fact that they hate him. They hate him mostly because they're racist, which is very important. It plays out in a host of ways. They also hate his rhetoric, because his rhetoric is sometimes a little bit even-handed, which is a sort of political sin sometimes. Or at least it used to be. The discourse on that has changed a lot, but we're not going to talk about that tonight. But Israel is now more isolated in the region than ever before. It has achieved something with the coup in Egypt, the reversal of the Islamist project, the political Islam that was on the rise through the process of the Arab Spring in a number of countries is being set back. That's also, in a very fundamental but somewhat counterintuitive way, a step back for the United States as well. Because even though the US has no great interest in political Islam as something good, they were prepared to move with that project through Turkey, Egypt, a number of other countries, and they're losing. Look what, the chaos in Egypt right now, absolute chaos in Syria where there are 5 separate wars going on, the disaster going on in Libya as the result of US intervention. All of this has been a disaster. On the question of strategic access, again, we lost the bases after the Iraq war. The regional war in Syria is messing up everything in the region. And what we're now seeing is that the project of the Arab Spring is on the decline, but in a way that isn't helping the US. So this empire is back to the question of the hammer and the nail. I think I'm about out of time, am I right? Oh, I have 2 more minutes, wow. I talk fast. Am I talking too fast?
Just one.
I'd spent enough time in New York that I talk really fast. But I think, we don't have time to get into all of it. I will say the 5 wars in Syria is important to kind of get that concept, because this becomes very crucial. There's the civil war, which is by far the worst, because civil wars are always the worst wars, that pits part of the Syrian population against a terribly repressive regime. Then there's a regional war that is essentially being played out between, at the beginning, Iran versus Saudi Arabia, with all the other countries backing one or the other, being played out to the last Syria. Then there's the sectarian war, playing out with the same countries on the same sides, but with a different set of motivations on the Sunni-Shia divide, which is now spilling over outside Syria throughout the region. Then you have the war between the US and Russia. It's a resumption of the Cold War being fought largely over control of naval bases, control over the sea lanes, all of that. And finally, you have the longstanding war between the US and Israel on one hand, and Iran on the other hand, also being fought out in Syria. All these wars being fought to the last Syria. So who pays the price? Of course, the people of Syria. Who benefits? The war profiteers, the manufacturers of weapons who are sending weapons to both sides, who very much like the Iran-Iraq war of the 1980s, want the war to continue, so they support the weaker side so that it keeps going. Who benefits? Capital. Who benefits? Capitalism, particularly the people who produce weapons, who manufacture weapons. They're the ones who benefit across the board. Who loses? The people. So that's what we're facing right now in the Middle East. And so when we look at what's changing, US power has diminished, US influence has diminished. The US no longer has the ability, despite sending $1.3 billion a year directly to the Egyptian military with no oversight by the Egyptian government. The US is really kind of small potatoes in that environment because the regional players, now that there's been this coup, are now pouring in $8 billion from Saudi Arabia, $4 billion from the UAE, another, I think, $3 billion from Oman. So this is now a whole new thing where the US doesn't really have any power. You may have seen the article in yesterday's Washington Post, the most critical interview ever given by an Egyptian general about the United States, who had just sent him a check for $1.3 billion, basically saying, the US is terrible, they're not supporting us, and we don't think we should have to listen to them. They should go talk to the Islamists because that's who they like. And it's, right, so when we look at sort of who we have influence with, this is a really complicated set of questions. So, we're not gonna have time for all of it now, but it is a set of wars that are being waged throughout a region that is as volatile and desperate for an end to wars as could be. This is after 20 years of war in Iraq, 30 years of war in Afghanistan. It's a mess. The US is a hammer, and the problem is the Middle East is not a nail. But when you're a hammer, you treat it like a nail, and it comes back to bite you in the end. That's the challenge that we face today. Thank you.
All right.
Thank you. I'd like to thank as well the organizers and the WRL for having me here as well. I'm just going to launch into this. So I'm going to take a bit of a different perspective. The bitter reality that peace and social justice movement must accept is that American empire is alive and well. There are challenges to U.S. power, but no real challengers. There are limits, but there have always been limits to American empire. During the height of its global powers in the 1950s, Washington confronted limits when it could not carry out the rollback doctrine during the Korean War. There are crises, especially those induced by finance capital, but we should not conflate that with the decline of American empire. From the perspective of capitalists, the U.S. is the sole indispensable nation state when it comes to ordering the global financial and political order. When extreme panic gripped global markets in 2008, it was the U.S. Treasury, the U.S. Federal Reserve, U.S.-dominated international financial institutions that financed and coordinated the rescue of capitalism in conjunction with Wall Street and other central banks. They did it on the backs of workers and underdeveloped nations, but does that matter to them? The rich and powerful would be delighted to hire half the working class to kill the other half. The U.S. still orders the global economic and financial order. The dollar is still the global reserve currency. U.S. bonds and bills are still one of the most sought-after investment assets, which acts as a giant subsidy to the U.S. state and public, along with the rights of seniorage. In other words, being able to make money just by printing money. Virtually every other nation in the world looks to the US, including all of West Europe, Japan, Canada, India, Brazil, Turkey, Mexico, South Africa, Nigeria, and even China, to regulate the international economic order. China may grumble, but it knows it's conjoined with the US economy and cannot sell off its large holdings of US securities without severely damaging itself. Every nation, even Cuba and North Korea, is tied into the world capitalist order. Left parties and states in Greece, Bolivia, and Ecuador are all economically hemmed in by American-led capitalist globalization. Russia and Venezuela may enjoy tweaking Washington, but they are entirely dependent on supplying raw materials to global markets. The US may be in a series of quagmires, but what other nation in the world can wage 6 wars at once with minimal impact on domestic opinion and virtually none on its economy or financial markets? I'll also say I think it's a mistake to say the US lost the Iraq War. It didn't win, but it still has the largest embassy in the world in the center of Baghdad, overflowing with thousands of spies, soldiers, and mercenaries. Believing the Pentagon is the main source of US power is like believing that the heavily armed NYPD outside of Michael Bloomberg's mansion is the main source of his power, rather than just the iron fist of the ruling class. Another way to understand why militarism is secondary is that there are members of the ruling class and even segments of the ruling class, such as libertarians, who want to rein in the projection of US military power. But there is not a single member of the ruling class who is anti-capitalist. Thus, the starting point for any analysis of geopolitics is to acknowledge the US is the global hegemon without equal and will almost certainly continue to be so for decades to come. The other unfortunate reality for the anti-war movement is it's highly difficult to organize against war and militarism, which is more a symptom of empire than a cause. Now, the US has limited ability to project large-scale military force because of the legacy of Vietnam and the Iraq War has affected both domestic and international opinion. It can disrupt and destroy by using robotic warfare, standoff weapons, and cyber warfare, but its economic tools are just as devastating, as is the case with the sanctions now brutalizing the Iranian people, or the sanctions that brutalized the Iraqis before. At the same time, the Pentagon's remote control warfare is also a huge success. The flip side of the quagmire is that the US can wage wars for years with little public outcry or even knowledge because few, if any, Americans are dying. One inescapable fact we have to confront is domestic opposition to wars rises and falls in lockstep with American deaths, so the Pentagon has successfully gone about minimizing American deaths. As such, the anti-war movement is bereft of a mass base. It's composed of those who have the time, resources, and inclination to educate themselves deeply on the subject and then take action. And because the military acts as a giant jobs program for workers and middle-income groups, these factors select for an anti-war movement composed mainly of educated, older, middle-class whites. Thus, anti-war activists are generally, and I'm speaking generally, not of everyone, are involved because of individually shaped moral and political concerns, not because of their material conditions. In other words, most of us who oppose US imperialism or militarism are not at personal risk of serving in these wars or subjected to these wars. I include myself in this definition, which is just a clinical analysis and not meant as a pejorative. The other difficult issue to confront is the role of ecological destruction in empire. Simply put, global capitalism employs a political economy of ecological destruction. First, global warming is not the only threat to the biosphere. There are 7 intertwined threats, such as massive species extinction, deforestation, ocean collapse, and desertification. Second, as Naomi Klein astutely points out, the business model of the hydrocarbon industry, and indeed capitalism in general, is planetary destruction. Mining, drilling, logging, extraction, combined with all the poisons and toxins produced by industry. While this has created a crisis for humanity and the entire planet, for capitalism, this is a very important point. The ecological crisis is also its solution. We need to come to grips with this fact as well. Ecological destruction and then remediation is a huge source of business activity and jobs. Fracking, for example, is an industrial horror show, but it generates hundreds of thousands of jobs in drilling, services, and related industries, while many landowners, especially in economically depressed regions, support fracking, hoping to cash in on mineral leases. Then, after all the environment is foul, government comes in to clean it all up, creating new jobs. Take the Deepwater Horizon oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico. BP hired thousands of local residents, literally anyone and everyone they can find, for the cleanup. Not because it had any chance of ameliorating the disaster, but because it wanted to buy off local communities and minimize opposition. One reporter who went down there to cover the devastation told me while demonstrations by affected fishing and indigenous communities drew a couple hundred people at most, BP packed a local sports stadium with more than 10,000 people cheering for more drilling, even as millions of barrels of crude oil were pouring into the Gulf. In the capitalist framework, a bizarre drawback of cleaner energy sources like solar and wind is that they don't produce as many jobs, precisely because their ecological impact is far more benign. Third, many other commercial sectors, such as organic food, natural products, and housing developments, capitalize on the anxiety of tens of millions of Americans to the ecological crisis, offering them false hope they can insulate themselves from planetary destruction. Fourth, there's a tendency on the left towards apocalypticism. That is the belief that the Earth and humanity are headed for extinction, or that there's nothing we can do about it, or perversely, there are some who welcome it because it will cause the collapse of industrial civilization and usher in an ecotopia of agrarian communalism. I'm sure you know some of that. Finally, we can't hide from the reality that 12 years into the war on terror, the anti-war movement is virtually invisible to the general public. I know this analysis may make the obstacles and tasks ahead seem overwhelming, but we have to confront this reality to organize for the long haul and go back to basics if we're serious about defeating American empire and capitalist militarism. Thank you.
Can I start?
Hi.
Oh, okay.
Can you hear me?
A little closer.
Okay, there you go.
First, I want to thank the World Sisters League for putting together this wonderful conference, and I've made a number of connections and commitments throughout the days I've been here, which will be carried forward, and I'm really appreciative of the work that Rosie and everybody has done. I think Arun has gone over some of what I wanted to say. And I'm going to go ahead and also try to suggest what's happened in the last 30 years and, in relation to the anti-militarist and environmental movements and their relationship to each other. I think that there are developments, if we think about it, over the past 30 years. When I started into this work in relation to the War Resisters League, I really made a connection with the War Resisters League through Grace Paley and Barbara Dimmick, who were mentors of mine. And at the time, I was involved with anti-nuclear activity and environmental thinking and relating that to feminist organizing. And I came to know Grace, who said, this is integrally related to militarism. You can't have environmentalism without an anti-militarist stance and without opposing nuclear weapons and nuclear power, and really brought into feminist work on the environment that kind of a perspective and that connection, and that's sort of woven together over decades. Now, certain things that may seem obvious at the time did not necessarily seem so, but I think the issue of how we sort of see what's being called in some general way the environmental crisis, which is also a crisis of capitalism, and also a crisis of a finite planet. Capitalism, is a grow or die enterprise. It depends on going forward, and the level of extraction and excavation of the planet and its finite resources has accelerated, and what's considered acceptable now or what is done now, it gets really worse and worse, and more devastating. And also, I think it's clear now that in the 80s, and I was thinking about this, and in the 70s, when this particular phase of what might be called the contemporary environmental movement was getting started, it was seen by many leftists as a liberal movement. I can remember the number of people who would say to me with a sneer, "Oh, nature, oh, you tree huggers, oh, that's really," as if that's what it was really about. I think now the level of the relationship to capitalism, that all the resources of the earth are being appropriated and sold back to us and stolen and destroyed, and that this is part of a whole larger political economy that we live in and rely on and are really a part of also. Those things I think are much clearer to people now, to people in general. Maybe I'm pushing back a little here, but I think that some of the relationships have become more transparent. If you think about it even in an old Marxist sense, that the curtain has lifted on some of what's actually going on. And so while it may seem that our movement is in bad straits here, I think it may be that there is a much more general, even if you look at things like public opinion polls, much more general awareness, and also these spectacles like the BP disaster being played out, greater knowledge and understanding of what's happening in Nigeria and in Latin America, all over the world. And I think as Americans, I think some of the leadership that we need, both how to understand these things, how to think about the future, is coming from other parts of the world. And so I think it's incumbent on us, even, far more in thinking from an environmental perspective, to understand not only what the movements are doing, what's happening, what's the status of policy, but also the understanding of the relationship between human beings, the earth, the economy, that's emerging in places like Latin America in particular, and the declaration of the rights of Mother Earth, that we start to see our planet as not only a resource for our exploitation and existing for and on behalf of human beings, but that is a living, sentient being in its own right, and that we are part of a web of nature, rather, and that we have to think about nature in that way and develop an ecological vision in order to sustain life. And so I think these things have become more clear to wider numbers of people. They aren't necessarily mobilized, but you do find, but I think also that, you find with the fracking issue, for example, and the pipeline issues, that, there are kind of organic ways that people begin connecting because these extractive industries are networked together. Think about the various pipeline, anti-pipeline efforts of which I am a part, the Spectra pipeline in particular has been something I've been part of. And, even Occupy in New York, for example, and I think other places, some of what's been able to continue to sustain itself is people who are working in what is broadly understood as environmental issues, to continue to organize and continue to network with each other. I think also that, the crop failures, drought, famine, the water issues, all these things I think are becoming more apparent to more people. And so the fact that, there's not at the moment a corresponding radical mass movement, is certainly true. But I think there's a much wider understanding in the issue of climate change, which really is but one issue, and we're going to talk about that. But the science, there's a consensus in the scientific community about certain things that are very fundamental to how capitalism operates. And so I think there's the potential, eventually, for translating these things into some kind of a political way of working that is capable of opposing them. And the War Resisters League, I think, has served, and I think about over that period of time also, as a location for a certain kind of nonviolent activism, as a place for a point of view that's secular and pacifist, but it's also a kind of the practicality of how you do engage in nonviolent direct action. And all these movements have practiced this and have developed and turned out activists, like people in this room, many of whom I know. And also, that even where it's not necessarily understood or attributed, I think the practice of nonviolent direct action and radical pacifism has found its way and has informed and been part of the tactics of the gay movement, in particular, the feminist movement, and every other kind of movement that we can think of in this country. So I think the War Resisters League has the part that's been played there, even when the numbers are small, the ideas, the trainings, the ways of understanding and thinking about it have created a tool chest, or are continuing to create a tool chest of tactics that can address these issues. It's based on communities of people who form resilient groups that know each other, we used to call affinity groups, in some conscious way. And so I think, we see certain things that are being touted as victories, in particular social issues, but, they really are where people, where one rightly asks the question, do we want an equal piece of a rotten carcinogenic pie? And what, the question of access or the privilege of participating is a very good question. So I think these things are not really, these so-called successes are very questionable. And so I think that's some of what I wanted to say. Another thing I wanted to say something about was the erosion of public spaces and what might be called, what we would call the commons, right? And the fight that people are having to wage over having a place to do our politics about all of this. And this is really an ecological and environmental issue. You do need physical location. We have cyberspace, and we also have okay, I'm getting my time. Okay, but this question of the public domain or the public commons and the need for that as a political space, as a meeting space, as a place to come together. That exists in physical space, it exists in other ways, but it also does exist in physical space. The need to hold, to make and hold and create physical gathering places, because I think face-to-face contact is an important thing. And to also create and to kind of continue the idea of a robust citizenry, that we're citizens. I don't really like so much the language of consumers. I prefer citizen. And that's what we need to do, and a kind of an active citizenship. And in America, we have a long tradition, we have a number of long traditions of active citizenship entering into the public world. And I think over the past, 30 or so years, the environmental movement has, has become in some ways more radical. Other people can comment on this, but I think you find key group organizations, mainstream organizations like the Sierra Club, people who formed 350.org, who 20 years ago were making sure that they were separate from the left. Y'all know who I'm talking about. And now not so much. Let everybody grow, let everybody evolve, right? But I think the relationships are becoming far more transparent. And so you really, you have much less, and on the left also, the acceptance that environmental politics is really fundamentally, the political economy and ecology are integral to each other. So I do feel, I guess, that there has been, there have been certain kind of crises of capitalism have become more and more acute, but there is a corresponding development of people who thought about this and who know about it. So I'm going to stop there, and then we can get to that. That's more.
Good evening. It's great to be here with you all. To answer the question, I think the current landscape today is one of illusion in America. And our president, who I like to call the magician, because I think it's important to always watch his other hand. So as we began talking about our dear friend from Toronto, talking about nuclear abolition, the magician has made wonderful speeches about the need for nuclear disarmament, nuclear abolition. But on the other hand, his other hand, he is doing the pivot into Asia Pacific, and at the same time, the surrounding of Russia. I just returned days ago from a 3-week trip to the Asia Pacific, where I was talking about and learning more about the implications of this Obama pivot. It really has the American people in a bind, right? Because the pivot means more military spending, more war preparation, And that means in this economy, the American people got to get on board because that's the only game in town. What's the #1 industrial export product of America today? And when weapons are your #1 industrial export product, what is your global marketing strategy for that product line? So as we do the pivot into the Asia Pacific, we need more ports of call, we need more barracks, we need more airfields. My liberal congresswoman from Portland, Maine, she votes recently in the last couple of years, she's been voting against the military budget. That's great, we got her to that point. But then she's first in line begging the Pentagon on bended knees for more contracts to build Aegis destroyers at Bath Iron Works. And why is that? Why is that? Why is it that we have to kill people in order to provide jobs for the people in our communities? But one of her lines, Shelley Pingree is her name, one of her lines is, we've got to get the allies to pay more for our bases around the world. And so that is indeed the strategy when I went around learning about the pivot. One illustration is Jeju Island in South Korea, where the United States is getting the government of South Korea to build a Navy base in a 500-year-old fishing and farming community of less than 2,000 people who have been in 24/7 nonviolent resistance for the past 6 or 7 years. Tomorrow morning, we're going to be showing a video at 9 o'clock in a workshop session called The Ghost of Jeju that tells the dramatic and heartbreaking and joyous story about these people in Gangjeong Village, and also really brings the pivot to the center of that film. I went to Australia, to Darwin, where Obama has himself visited, and has said that we're going to bring 2,500 Marines to this place, rotating them every 6 months, not permanently stationed, the point is, they say. And we're getting the Australian government, who's now cutting back on, guess what, social programs, in order to pay for the upgrade of the Robertson Barracks at Darwin. So the Pentagon has essentially become the primary resource extraction service for corporate globalization. China imports 80% of their oil on ships. So by expanding our military by 60% in the region, the theory then is we might not be able to compete with China economically, but if we control their access to resources, then we hold the keys to their economic engine. Or put another way, we hold a gun to their head. So today, with NATO expansion surrounding Russia and missile defense bases going into Poland and Romania, and a missile defense radar in Turkey, Russia, who has the world's largest supply of natural gas, is effectively being surrounded. At the same time, these Aegis destroyers, made where I live in Bath, Maine, are outfitted with these missile defense systems, and they're being assigned to the Mediterranean Sea, the Black Sea, the Baltic Sea, the Barents Sea in the coming years, beginning a coastal encirclement of Russia as well. And is the melting Arctic ice one reason why the U.S. is moving into those high north zones? Very well likely. When it comes to China, the U.S. has already deployed so-called missile defense systems on the ground, ground-based launchers in Taiwan, Okinawa, Japan, and South Korea. And again, these same Aegis destroyers and missile defense interceptors are going into Guam, South Korea, Japan, Philippines, Singapore, likely Vietnam, back to Cameron Bay, and other places in the region. And just a couple days ago, Stars and Stripes newspaper reported that the Air Force is getting into the act, moving also into Darwin. They're talking about bringing bombers into Darwin in Australia, and into Thailand, India, Philippines, Indonesia, Malaysia, in addition to bases that are already established in South Korea, Japan, Okinawa, and Guam. So this air, land, sea battle strategy that is underway, all coordinated and directed by space technology then, is clearly a very dangerous and provocative move on the part of our award-winning, peace-loving president. Since the last recent years, the U.S. Space Command has been annually wargaming a first strike attack on China set in the year 2016. They call it the red team versus the blue team. And in this first strike attack, the new super drone, the X-37, has shown that it can stay in orbit in space for more than 250 days, flies down from orbit in this computer war game, and drops a first strike attack on China. China has 20 nuclear missiles today that are capable of hitting the west coast of the United States. And with bunker buster bombs, they try to take out those 20 in that initial strike. Other weapon systems are then used in a follow-on attack. And China then tries, after the US first strike attack, China tries in the war game to do a retaliatory strike with their remaining few nuclear weapons. And they are then picked off by these so-called missile defense systems that are actually the shield after the first strike sword has launched into the heart of Chinese forces. This is why we hear today, both from Russia and China, forget about nuclear abolition. Forget about any more serious negotiations on getting rid of nuclear weapons as long as you're surrounding us with so-called missile defense systems. Can we hear that? Can we hear that? And can we begin to adjust our work accordingly? This will be, again, a dramatic cost. And the carbon blueprint of this largest carbon emitter agency on the face of the planet, the Pentagon, will only get worse. I want to say a quick something about the declining resources on this planet. The aerospace industry actually is very happy about the situation, and they tell us not to worry. They've discovered planets and planetary bodies with magnesium and cobalt and uranium and gold and water and all kinds of other resources on them. And NASA's #1 job today is create the technology to get out there so we can mine the sky effectively. And the nuclear industry is quite eager, as they view space as a new market in the coming years. They dream of nuclear-powered mining colonies on the moon and Mars and asteroids, and having nuclear rockets with reactors for engines go out and shuttle back and forth and bring the resources back to what the Mars Society calls a rotting, dying, stinking planet on Earth. Their vision is to go and terraform Mars so that we can move our civilization there. You know what that means, terraform Mars? Can you imagine the cost of turning Mars into a green planet? But the president of the Mars Society, Robert Zubrin, a Lockheed Martin executive, and others have been lobbying Congress for years to begin to create the infrastructure to terraform Mars. These little robots driving around Mars today are not looking for the origins of life. What they're doing is doing soil sampling and soil identification and mapping the surface of Mars for someday future mining colonies and everything else. So how do we get out from behind this 8 ball at this time? I think that we've got to increase the discussion about the conversion of the military-industrial complex. It has to become a part of our demands. Remembering what Frederick Douglass said, power concedes nothing without a demand. Here's a demand that would benefit the peace movement, the labor movement, the social justice movement, the environmental movement, converting the military-industrial complex at a time when we face this reality of climate change. I think this should be one of our collective demands of all of our movements. Thank you very much.
Okay. All right. Before we pose our next question to our speakers tonight, I just want to ask that anyone who has filled out a note card to pass it to one side of the aisle that you're on, okay? And our wonderful volunteers are gonna walk up and down those aisles and collect your note cards at this time. So, and then will y'all just bring that back to me? That's great. Both of them. Yep, all the cards you got.
The question cards, not the hero cards.
All of them. Yeah, both cards, both the hope card and the question card. Thank you very much. All right, so thanks for all of y'all's great insights into that first question. So we heard about U.S. empire, the militarized side, U.S. empire, the ongoingness of it side, the connections between anti-militarism and the environmental justice movements, the profitability of environmental destruction, and of course the U.S. pivot to East Asia and the Pacific. So there's a lot in there for us to unpack and discuss. And I know Ruth started getting some into the concrete next steps part of our program. So that's where I want to take us now. So the second question we have less time for each of our panelists, but what it is what does all this mean given what the landscape is that you all just laid out? And how should we, as the U.S. anti-war movement, be shifting our strategic focus and building power, given what this means for the future? So I'm going to start with Phyllis, and we'll go right down the line. I'll get these.
I was more interested in reading those.
Okay. See, you know what I'm saying?
Yeah, wow, this is a pretty rich beginning for a discussion. I think that we, as an anti-war movement, face enormous challenges. And I think we have to figure out how to answer those challenges in three separate levels. One is in responding to the crises of war and militarism, which is the basis of which we come together. Second is the longer term, how we build a movement that has sustainability and that can survive and grow and build and reach entirely new generations, one of our biggest challenges. And third, the strategic challenge of how we translate the victories that we win in public opinion into change of policy. So this is something we talk about a lot in the Palestine movement, where there's been enormous discourse change, but absolutely no motion in the politics, in the actual decision making. Starting with that last one, when we look at the issues of war, what we see is that we have enormous popular support, but it doesn't translate into power. So at the moment, 70+% of people in this country say that the US should not send weapons, should not in any way militarily assist the rebel side in Syria. On the one hand, it's a huge challenge that for Congress, for the administration, certainly for the Pentagon, that's of little or no interest. But the other part of it that's a big challenge for us is why are those people opposed? I'd like to say it's because we've been working for 20 years on the dangers of militarism and the dangers of military intervention, and people are finally getting it. Unfortunately, that's not the case. Probably half of them are opposed to it because they think Obama wants it and they're against anything Obama wants. That's part of it. For a lot of them, they're against it because they think that that Syrians are not worth one drop of American blood. So we can't claim, although we should obviously use it as a political point, we can't claim that the 70% of people in this country that are against intervention are on, quote, our side. So we have to figure out how to take that 70% and make it real and make it matter. You know, traditionally in this city, to have influence and power, you need to come to the table with either a lot of votes or a lot of money. We don't come with either one. A lot of people vote the way we would like them to vote on certain specific issues, but they don't do it as part of a movement. It's not a mobilized power, and people in Washington, in Congress, and in the administration